Hey guys, welcome to the first video for chapter 32. You see the title for chapter 32 is Societies at Crossroads. And you look at the four societies we'll be talking about: the Ottoman Empire, Russia, China, and Japan. Now, as the 19th century ends and we're getting into the 20th century, you're starting to see a lot of transition in a few of these different major societies. Such as China go back thousands of years. But industrialization is changing things. It's really changing the balance of power throughout the world. Europe, particularly Western Europe and the United States, are emerging as superpowers. The East, China, is starting to be left behind. Japan is going to start to realize that they need to get on board with all this stuff. And eventually you're going to see, the complete breakup, downfall of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the Russian Empire and the beginning of the Soviet Union. So an awful lot of change going on during this time period. Let's first talk about the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe, as you see by the title here. The reason being was the 18th century was a rough one for them. In chapter 28, we talked about how the 16th and 17th centuries, the Islamic empires were being passed over by the European nations in terms of technology and trade influence. Now, this problem for the Muslim world would only get worse after Europe industrialized. So by the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was kind of colloquially known as the sick man of Europe. Now, the first thing we'll discuss is its military decline. By the late 17th century, Ottoman armies were not even the elite in the Middle East anymore. Forget about in the world. They fell behind European armies in technology and training, and most significant was the decline of the Janissaries as the backbone of the Ottoman army. They became more involved with politics and military strength, and this led to an overall decline in military quality, and it left the empire vulnerable. This military weakness in turn led to a loss of territories. In the late 1800s, the empire could not hold on to several territories that broke away. Right? You look on the map, territories lost up here, the Crimean Peninsula. Then you see territories lost in North Africa, up around here, Bosnia and Romania. And then, territories lost 1878 and 1914. This was really the heartbreaker for them, Egypt, when they lost the Nile Peninsula here. And that was very, very embarrassing for them. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 might not have succeeded, but it destabilized the region. It led to a local general, Muhammad Ali, general, not boxer, taking control in 1805. Now, Egypt was still technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but by 1820, the Ottoman government had no say in what Egypt did. And to make matters worse, the empire also suffered serious economic problems. The Atlantic exploration and maritime trade routes established in the 16th and 17th centuries, this meant that a lot less overland trade passing through Ottoman territory. You look at the major European trade routes around 1750, everything was overseas. You had the Atlantic trade going back and forth. Remember our triangular trade. You had the Pacific trade, the Indian Ocean trade. What's left out of this? Istanbul, right there in the middle. Right, so trade is not going through the Middle East the way that it used to be because you can go faster and you can ship a lot more overseas. And also, industrialization made Britain and other Western nations leaders in textile production, and this devastated those industries in the Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire was quickly becoming economically dependent on the industrialized world, the way that Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia was. This lack of power and influence compared to the Western world is exemplified by these things called the capitulations. Capitulations are basically agreements that gave Europeans this thing called extraterritoriality. Essentially, this means that Europeans are exempt from Ottoman law. Only European laws apply to them, even if they are living or traveling in Ottoman territory. A British merchant can therefore not be punished for doing something that is illegal in Ottoman territory if it is not illegal back in Britain. The Sultan agreed to these initially to avoid widespread conflict with large numbers of foreign merchants, but it was an embarrassment for the government to show such a lack of power in their own lands. Now, reform and organization. Eventually, the widespread problems led to calls for change. Reform movements met with limited success, but the most comprehensive efforts to change Ottoman government and society were made by the Sultan Mahmud II. Now, Mahmud was Sultan from 1808 to 1839. He took steps to make sure his reforms weren't seen as too European. Reforms made by his predecessor and cousin, Sultan Selim III, were interpreted that way, and it ended in Selim's assassination by the Janissaries. Despite his efforts to make it seem as though his reforms strengthened Ottoman traditions, he did try to remodel the army like a European one. Now, this obviously would anger the Janissaries, which saw it as a direct threat to their long-held status. But unlike his cousin, Mahmud went on the offensive against them and had them massacred by forces loyal to him. From that point on, Ottoman soldiers dressed more like a European army, and Ottoman officers trained in European military institutions. He also tried to westernize the government by ending the feudal system, modernizing the transportation and communication systems, and so forth. Although the empire had shrunk during his reign, it was actually more stable and politically powerful than it had been for a while. Still, there was a continued call for more radical reform, leading to a period known as the Tanzimat era. Now, Tanzimat means reorganization. Tanzimat reformers wanted changes in the military, but also legal and educational reforms. They used the European Enlightenment reforms, Enlightenment reforms as a model, and made significant changes to Ottoman legal codes, such as public trials, rights of privacy, equality for all Ottoman citizens, regardless of religion, and so forth. You see this kind of painting here. And it shows the kind of the ultimate result of the Tanzimat reforms. This female figure representing liberty, she's having her chains from the block broken, and this angel up here, on the banner, it reads the three words from the French Revolution: liberty, fraternity, equality. So you see the heavy European Enlightenment influence here in the Tanzimat reforms. Now, despite some changes, there was still opposition to the Tanzimat reforms. This came from a couple different groups. And because Tanzimat reform made Ottoman society more secular, conservative Muslims opposed them. Aside from the secularization, these guys didn't like that the reforms gave more rights to Jews and Christians. Another group who opposed the reforms were known as the Young Ottomans. This group didn't so much totally oppose the Tanzimat reforms as strongly criticize them for not doing enough. They wanted more individual liberties and a decentralization of government control. This spirit of radical change eventually led to the Young Turk era. Now, this era started during the reign of Abdul Hamid II. It's important to remember that Abdul Hamid didn't start the Young Turks reforms, but rather they started because of his actions. He was put into power to create a constitutional monarchy, similar to what you have in Great Britain, but he suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and executed or exiled many liberal reformers. Abdul Hamid's rule as a despot led to the rise of a new reform group known as the Young Turks. It's important to remember that they were not particularly young, nor were they all Turkish. It was founded in 1889 by exiled Ottomans living in Paris. So you had a healthy European influence in this. It strongly promoted reform. It called for Enlightenment ideals like universal suffrage, everybody can vote, equality before the law, freedom of religion, public education, a secular government, even the emancipation of women. They inspired a military coup in 1908 that led to the constitution being restored and Abdul Hamid giving up the throne. A new sultan was put in place, but he would be a figurehead until the empire's collapse after World War I. Aside from government reforms, the Young Turks also wanted to make Turkish the dominant culture. You see the gathering here of them signing the new constitution, and you see the Turkish flag very prominently displayed in the background. This aggravated other ethnicities under Ottoman rule, especially Arabs. Then this would come back to haunt them in World War I, when the Allies, particularly the French and the British, would use this resentment to recruit Arab help against the Ottomans. Now, despite the reforms of the Young Turks, the Ottoman Empire continued to decline. The only reason it really stayed in existence as long as it did was because European nations feared how its collapse would upset the balance of power. So it talks about the last gasps of the Ottoman Empire, and in the next video, we'll talk about the changes that they were attempting to make, at least in Russia.